December 22nd, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. I stood inside the captured American M4 Sherman tank, running my hands over the welded seams, and for the first time in 6 years of war, I understood with absolute clarity that Germany was going to lose. If this story resonates with you, please subscribe and hit that like button. Comment below and tell me what you think about engineering, war, and the machines that define history. Your support helps keep these technical and personal stories alive. My name is Hans Steiner. I was 28 years old in December 1944. I was an Oberleutnant, first lieutenant, commanding a Panzer IV AUSF, H, in the 2nd Panzer Division. I'd been fighting since 1939, Poland, France, Russia. I'd seen victories and defeats. I'd destroyed dozens of enemy tanks. I'd lost friends, lost crew members, lost any illusions I'd had about the glory of war. But until I stood inside that Sherman, until I saw with my own eyes what American industry could produce, I still believed we might win. Or at least, that we might not lose. That belief died in that tank. This is the story of how a machine taught me the truth about modern war, how engineering philosophy revealed national character, how I learned to respect my enemy's genius even as I fought against them. But to understand that moment in December 1944, you need to understand how I got there. You need to understand what it meant to be a German tank commander in a war we were slowly realizing we couldn't win. I joined the Hitler Youth in 1934. I was 18 years old. This is hard to explain to people now, after everything that happened, after the Holocaust, after the camps, after the world learned what the Nazi regime really was. But in 1934, we didn't know, or we chose not to know, or we were too young and stupid to understand. What I saw in 1934 was a Germany that had been humiliated after the Great War, a Germany with massive unemployment and hyperinflation, a Germany that felt betrayed by the Treaty of Versailles. And here was a movement that promised to restore German pride, to give us work, to make us strong again. I was young, I was unemployed. My father had died in the Great War, and my mother struggled to feed us. The Hitler Youth offered purpose, camaraderie, physical training, a sense of belonging. So I joined, like millions of other young Germans who didn't understand what we were really joining. I'm not making excuses. I'm explaining. There's a difference. In 1936, I joined the Wehrmacht. The German military was expanding rapidly, rebuilding after the restrictions of Versailles. I was good with mechanics. I'd worked in my uncle's machine shop as a teenager. So they assigned me to the Panzer troops, tank crews. The training was excellent, rigorous. The German military tradition emphasized discipline, technical competence, tactical flexibility. We learned to operate Panzer IV and the SAU tanks, light tanks, really just training vehicles. But we also learned the theory, blitzkrieg, lightning war. Use armor and air power together to break through enemy lines, then exploit deep into the rear. Mobile warfare, speed and shock. It was exciting. It felt modern, revolutionary. We were going to change how wars were fought. By 1939, I was a sergeant, commanding a Panzer II in the invasion of Poland. That was my first combat, September 1939. We drove across the Polish border in a column of tanks and trucks, and for 3 weeks we smashed through Polish defenses like they weren't even there. The Polish army fought bravely, but they had cavalry, literally horses, against our tanks and Stukas. It was a slaughter. We reached Warsaw in 2 weeks. Poland surrendered in 5 weeks. It seemed so easy. France was harder. May 1940. The French had better tanks than us. Their Char B1 and Sommelier S-35 were superior to our Panzer IIs and IIIs in armor and firepower. But they used them wrong. They spread them out in small packets supporting infantry. We concentrated ours in armored divisions and punched through their lines at Sedan. I was in a Panzer III by then, a gunner. I remember the shock of encountering a French Char B1 head-on. Our 37mm gun couldn't penetrate its armor. We had to maneuver around it, hit it from the side. But there were only a few of those tanks. Most French tanks we encountered were obsolete, or poorly commanded, or ran out of fuel because their logistics were terrible. France fell in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The nation that had fought Germany to a standstill for 4 years in the Great War fell in 6 weeks. We couldn't believe it. We thought we were invincible. That illusion lasted until Russia. June 26, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union. I was a platoon leader by then, commanding 5 Panzer III tanks. We crossed the border into Soviet territory and immediately everything changed. The scale was incomprehensible. Russia is vast. Not just large, vast beyond understanding until you've tried to cross it. The distances are crushing, the roads are terrible, the weather is apocalyptic. And the Russians just kept coming. We destroyed Soviet tank after Soviet tank. In the first weeks, we thought we were winning easily. Soviet tanks were obsolete, their tactics were rigid, their commanders were incompetent because Stalin had purged the good ones. We advanced hundreds of kilometers, surrounded entire Soviet armies, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, but they kept coming, always more tanks, more soldiers, more weapons. We'd destroy a Soviet division and another would appear. We'd capture a city and find it meaningless because there were always more cities, more territory, more Russians, and their new tanks. In October 1941, we encountered the T-34 for the first time. I was outside Mtsensk when a T-34 emerged from the woods. We hit it with our 50mm gun. The shell bounced off. The T-34 kept coming, destroyed 2 of my tanks before we could maneuver behind it and kill it. The T-34 was a shock, sloped armor that deflected our shells, a powerful 76mm gun, wide tracks that didn't get stuck in mud, good speed, and the Soviets were producing them by the thousands, while we were still building Panzer IIIs that couldn't penetrate them frontally. That was when I first understood that production matters, that quantity has a quality all its own, but I didn't fully grasp it yet. I still believed in German technical superiority, in our better training, in our superior tactics. Then came winter, Russian winter, December 1941. Temperatures dropped to -40°C. Our tanks wouldn't start. The oil froze. The diesel gelled. The ammunition wouldn't fire reliably. Our soldiers froze in uniforms designed for Western Europe. Frostbite was epidemic, and the Russians, they kept fighting. Their tanks started, their weapons worked. They were used to this cold. I spent 2.5 years on the Eastern Front, 2.5 years of hell, Kursk, Kharkov, the constant grinding retreat after Stalingrad. Watching the Wehrmacht slowly bled white by an enemy that seemed to have infinite resources. I was wounded twice. Once by shrapnel from Soviet artillery, once when my Panzer III was hit by a T-34. I was the only survivor of my crew. I crawled out of the burning tank with second-degree burns and watched my friends die inside because we couldn't get them out. They sent me back to Germany to recover, promoted me to Oberleutnant, gave me a new command, a Panzer IV AUSF H, better tank. Longer 75mm gun that could kill T-34s frontally, better armor, more reliable. But by 1944, even the Panzer IV was becoming obsolete. The Soviets had upgraded to T-34-85s with bigger guns. We were always one step behind. In September 1944, they transferred me to the Western Front, to France, which by then was falling to the Americans and British. But we pulled back to Germany, regrouped, and in December, we got new orders. A major offensive. Through the Ardennes forest. The goal, punch through the American lines, capture Antwerp, split the Allied forces in 2. If successful, it would prolong the war, maybe force a negotiated peace. I didn't believe it would work. By December 1944, I'd seen too much. I'd seen how the Allies had unlimited fuel, unlimited ammunition, unlimited everything. I'd seen our supply lines crumble. I'd seen Germany running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, food, men, hope. But I was a soldier. I followed orders. And part of me, a small, irrational part, hoped maybe we could pull it off. Maybe German tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage one more time. The offensive began on December 16th, 1944. We achieved complete surprise. The Americans weren't expecting an attack through the Ardennes. The weather was terrible, fog and snow, which meant Allied air power was grounded. We punched through the American lines, captured towns, took prisoners. For 2 days, it felt like 1940 again, like we might actually win. My Panzer IV was part of a spearhead driving toward Bastogne, a critical crossroads town. If we could take Bastogne, we could continue west toward Antwerp. If the Americans held it, our entire offensive would stall. We reached the outskirts of Bastogne on December 20th. The Americans were rushing reinforcements into the town. The 101st Airborne Division dropped in by truck because there was no time for proper deployment. We surrounded the town, tried to take it. Failed. The Americans held. For 2 days, we fought around Bastogne. My Panzer IV engaged American armor, Shermans mostly. We destroyed several, lost one of my platoon tanks to a Sherman's 75mm gun. The fighting was brutal, close range, urban terrain, ambush conditions. On December 22nd, we captured a small town northeast of Bastogne. The Americans had pulled back the night before, leaving equipment behind, supplies, ammunition, and one M4 Sherman tank sitting in the town square, apparently abandoned intact. My crew and I approached cautiously. American tanks were sometimes booby-trapped, but this one seemed genuinely abandoned. No explosives, no demolition charges, just left behind in the chaotic retreat. "Get it started," I ordered my driver, Feldwebel Klaus Richter. Klaus was a genius with engines. If anyone could start an enemy tank, it was him. Klaus climbed into the driver's position, looked around, started touching controls. "Oberst, this is remarkable. Everything is labeled. In English, yes, but clear. And look, the starter is electric. Just press a button." He pressed the starter. The engine turned over and started on the first try. Klaus looked at me, stunned. It just started. In this cold, our Panzer takes 10 minutes to warm up and half the time won't start at all. This just started. I climbed into the Sherman. My crew followed. Klaus on driver, Otto Müller on radio, Werner Fischer the gunner, young Hans Weber the loader. We explored the American tank like archaeologists discovering a tomb. And what we found changed everything. I thought I knew about tanks, about war, about engineering, about what we were really fighting against. The first thing that struck me was how spacious it felt. The Sherman was big. Not as heavily armored as a German Panther or Tiger, but roomy inside. The crew positions were well spaced. You could move around without constantly hitting your elbows on things. "Look at this," Werner said from the gunner's position. "The periscope. It's better than ours, clearer optics, wider field of view. And this traverse mechanism, it's powered. I don't have to hand crank the turret like in our Panzer IV. He was right. The Sherman had a powered turret traverse driven by hydraulics. Point the gun, press a button, the turret turns. Smooth, fast, precise. Our Panzer IV had manual traverse. The gunner turned a hand crank. It worked, but it was slow and exhausting in combat. "The gun," Werner continued, examining the 75mm M3. "It's shorter than our long 75mm. Probably less muzzle velocity, but look at the ammunition storage. It's in water jackets, wet storage. If we're hit, the water prevents the ammunition from cooking off. That was brilliant. In German and Soviet tanks, ammunition was stored dry. If a tank was penetrated, the ammunition often exploded, killing the crew instantly. The Americans had solved this with a simple solution: wrap the ammunition in water-filled jackets. Ingenious. "The radio," Otto said, examining the American set. Herr Oberleutnant, this is incredible. It's not just a radio, it's an intercom system too. The crew can talk to each other through headsets without shouting, and the radio itself, it's compact. Reliable looking, mass-produced, but high quality. German tanks had intercoms too, but they were often temperamental. The American version looked simpler and more robust. Klaus was in the driver's position, examining everything with the intensity of a watchmaker studying a competitor's work. The transmission. Herr Oberleutnant, you need to see this. It's automatic. Not fully automatic, but semi-automatic. The driver doesn't have to match engine speed to gear. The transmission does it. And the clutch, it's designed to be easily replaced. Modular. If it breaks, you don't need a specialized mechanic. Any competent driver can swap it out in the field. The engine, Klaus continued, his voice carrying a tone of professional respect. It's the Continental R975 Radial, an aircraft engine adapted for tanks. Not as powerful as our Maybach, but look at the accessibility. The entire engine deck lifts off. You can pull the engine in an hour. Our Panzer IV takes half a day to remove the engine, and that's if nothing's seized up. I climbed out of the turret and stood on top of the Sherman, looking at the engine deck. Klaus was right. The entire back of the tank was designed for easy maintenance, large access hatches, clearly marked inspection points, everything designed to be serviced quickly by ordinary mechanics, not specialists. This was the real revelation. The Sherman wasn't designed to be the best tank. It was designed to be good enough and to be produced in enormous numbers and maintained easily by average mechanics under field conditions. "Look at the welds," Werner said, running his hand along the hull. "Perfect, consistent. This was made in a factory with modern welding equipment and quality control, mass-produced but to exacting standards. Our tanks are still partially hand-built, each one slightly different. These Americans, they've industrialized war. We spent 2 hours examining that Sherman. Every minute revealed something new, something that challenged my assumptions about tank design. The armor was sloped, but not as well as Soviet T-34s, thinner than German Tigers, but adequate, and more importantly, consistent. Every Sherman had the same armor thickness in the same places. You could train crews on one Sherman, and they'd know exactly how to fight in any other Sherman. The gun stabilizer, gyroscopic. It kept the gun roughly on target, even as the tank moved over rough terrain. Not perfect, but it meant an American crew could shoot while moving with some accuracy. We had to stop to shoot accurately. The Americans could shoot on the move, the vision systems. The driver had excellent forward visibility through a wide periscope. The tank commander had a rotating cupola with vision blocks all around. The gunner had good optics. Everyone could see. In a German tank, visibility was often poor, especially for the driver. The ergonomics, controls were laid out logically. Levers and buttons were positioned where they made sense. Labels everywhere. An American crew could learn to operate this tank in days. Our Panzer IV took weeks to master because everything was less intuitive. But the most important thing wasn't any single feature. It was the philosophy behind the entire design. "This tank isn't meant to be superior," I said aloud, finally understanding. "It's meant to be sufficient, good enough to fight, easy enough to build in enormous numbers, simple enough that any crew can learn it, robust enough that any mechanic can fix it. They're not trying to build the best tank. They're trying to build 10,000 good enough tanks." Klaus nodded slowly. "And we're trying to build 100 perfect tanks. But perfect doesn't matter if you're outnumbered 100 to 1. We stood in silence, absorbing what this meant. The Sherman represented something bigger than just tank design. It represented American industrial might, American production philosophy, American logistics, American abundance. Germany built Tigers, massive, powerful, beautifully engineered machines that could destroy any Allied tank in a one-on-one fight. But Tigers broke down constantly. They guzzled fuel. They required specialized mechanics. They took months to build. Germany produced 1,347 Tigers during the entire war. America built Shermans, adequate, reliable, mass-produced machines that could be outfought individually but won through numbers. America produced approximately 50,000 Shermans. 50,000 versus 1,347, even if every Tiger destroyed 10 Shermans before being destroyed itself. And they didn't. The mathematics were impossible. "We're looking at why we're going to lose," Werner said quietly. "One tank, but it tells the whole story. They can replace this Sherman tomorrow. We can't replace our Panzer IV if we lose it. We're fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that can outproduce us 100 to 1. He was right, and I'd known it intellectually for months. But seeing it, touching it, understanding the engineering philosophy behind it, that made it real in a way that statistics never could. "Pack it up," I ordered. "We need to get back to our lines. The offensive is failing. The weather's clearing. Their Air Force will be back soon, and when they come, they'll come with 1,000 Shermans to replace the ones we've destroyed." We climbed out of the American tank. Left it where it was. No point trying to capture it or use it. We had no fuel to spare, and it would be bombed by our own Luftwaffe if they saw an American tank moving in German-held territory. As we walked back to our Panzer IV, young Hans Weber, 19 years old, on the Eastern Front for only 3 months, asked the question that was on all our minds. "Herr Oberleutnant, if they can build so many tanks so easily, with such good quality, why are we still fighting? How can we possibly win?" I didn't answer immediately. How do you tell a 19-year-old boy that he's fighting for a lost cause? That the war is already over, we just haven't admitted it yet? That every day we continue fighting is another day of pointless death? "We fight because we're soldiers," I said finally, "because we have orders, because our families are behind us and the enemy is in front of us. We fight because that's what soldiers do." It was a coward's answer. But what else could I say? The truth? That we were fighting for a regime that had committed unspeakable evil? That we were prolonging a war that was already lost? That every Sherman we destroyed would be replaced tomorrow, but every German tank we lost was irreplaceable? I couldn't say that. Not yet. Not to Hans, who still had some shred of belief that we were the good guys, that we were defending Germany, that our cause was just. But standing there in that captured Belgian town, looking at the Sherman tank that represented everything we were fighting against, I knew. The war was over. We just hadn't stopped dying yet. The offensive collapsed over the next week. On December 23rd, the weather cleared. The Allied air forces returned in overwhelming strength. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, British Typhoons. They destroyed our supply columns. They bombed our fuel depots. They strafed our tanks. Without fuel, our panzers became pillboxes. Without ammunition, they became targets. Without air cover, the Luftwaffe was a ghost by December 1944. We were defenseless. American reinforcements poured in, Shermans, dozens of them, hundreds. They didn't try to fight us one-on-one. They surrounded us, bypassed strong points, used their superior numbers and mobility to isolate German units and destroy them piecemeal. My Panzer IV fought for 5 more days. We destroyed 3 Shermans. Lost 1 tank in my platoon to American tank destroyers. Lost another to mechanical failure. The transmission broke, and we had no spare parts. On December 28th, we received orders to retreat. The offensive had failed. Bastogne hadn't fallen. We'd pushed 60 kilometers into American lines and achieved nothing except losing tanks and men we couldn't replace. We retreated through the Ardennes. American artillery followed us. American aircraft harassed us. Every kilometer back was paid for in burning vehicles and dead soldiers. On January 3rd, 1945, my Panzer IV ran out of fuel. We were 10 kilometers inside Germany. No fuel trucks reached us. No supply convoy. Nothing. We sat there, a 40-ton steel coffin with empty tanks. "Destroy the gun," I ordered. "Drain any remaining fuel. We're abandoning it." Klaus looked heartbroken. He'd kept that panzer running through Russia, through France, through Belgium. He'd nursed it through mechanical failures, improvised repairs, kept it going when any reasonable machine would have died. And now we were abandoning it for lack of fuel. "The Amis will capture it," he said. "They'll examine it, learn from it, like we did with their Sherman." "It doesn't matter," I said. "They don't need to learn from us. They're already winning." We walked. For 3 days we walked through the snow, heading east into Germany. Joined streams of other retreating German soldiers. The roads were clogged with abandoned vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, all out of fuel, all useless. On January 6th, we reached a Wehrmacht collection point. They assigned us to a reserve panzer battalion forming near Frankfurt. New tanks, supposedly. New equipment. New offensive, supposedly. But I knew better. I'd seen the Sherman. I'd understood the message it sent. This war was over. Everything from here on was just dying for nothing. The war dragged on for 4 more months. 4 months of retreat, 4 months of watching the Wehrmacht disintegrate, 4 months of pointless death. I was assigned a new Panzer IV, fought in the defense of the Rhine, retreated into Bavaria, watched American Sherman tanks roll through Germany like they owned it, which by April 1945 they did. On April 28, 1945, my new tank was destroyed by an American P-47 rocket. The aircraft came out of nowhere, fired 2 rockets, and my Panzer IV erupted in flames. I was thrown from the turret, landed hard, broke my left arm and several ribs. My crew didn't make it out. Klaus, Otto, Werner, all killed instantly. Young Hans Weber, who'd asked me why we were still fighting back in December, dead at 19. I lay in a field in Bavaria, watching my tank burn, listening to American armor approaching. I could have tried to escape, could have run, but I didn't. I just lay there. An American Sherman rolled up, the turret hatch opened. A young American lieutenant, probably my age, looked down at me. "Sprechen Sie English?" he asked in terrible German. "Yes," I said. "I speak English." "You need a medic. We'll get you fixed up. The war's over, just a few more days. Hitler's probably dead already. You're going to a POW camp. You'll be treated according to Geneva Convention." "I know," I said. "I saw your Sherman. In December. At Bastogne. I knew it was over then." The American looked confused. "You saw a Sherman. So what? We've got thousands of them." "Exactly," I said. "That's exactly the point." They took me to a field hospital, fixed my arm, put my ribs in a bandage. 2 days later, Hitler killed himself in Berlin. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. 6 years, 60 million dead, Europe in ruins, Germany destroyed, occupied, divided, the Nazi regime gone, the Holocaust revealed. Everything we'd fought for, shown to be evil, and I was alive, 29 years old, POW in American hands, waiting to learn what would happen to German soldiers now that the war was over. I spent 15 months in a POW camp in France. The Americans and British ran it. They treated us correctly, not kindly but correctly. We had food, medical care, shelter, more than German POWs had given Soviet prisoners, more than we deserved. In the camp we learned the full truth. The concentration camps, the death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the Roma, the disabled, the homosexuals, the political prisoners, all of it. Some soldiers claimed they didn't know. Maybe some truly didn't. I knew something. Not the full scale, not the systematic nature. But I knew Jews were being persecuted. I knew people were disappearing. I knew the regime was evil. I chose not to think about it. Chose to focus on my duty. Chose to tell myself I was just a soldier, not a Nazi, not responsible. But I was responsible. We all were. By fighting for that regime, by keeping the war going, by following orders, we were complicit. The blood was on all our hands. In August 1946, they released me, sent me back to Germany, to a country that no longer existed as I'd known it, divided between East and West, occupied, destroyed, starving, traumatized. I went home to Stuttgart. My mother had died during an Allied bombing raid in 1944. My brother had been killed in Stalingrad. My sister had survived but was living in ruins, scavenging for food. I got a job in a machine shop. The same uncle who taught me mechanics before the war still had a business somehow. I worked with my hands, fixed things, didn't talk about the war. Nobody wanted to talk about the war. For decades I just existed, worked, married a good woman named Greta in 1950, had 2 children, tried to be normal. Tried to forget, but I never forgot that Sherman, standing inside it, understanding through that one machine the scale of what we'd been fighting, understanding that we'd been doomed from the moment America entered the war, understanding that German engineering excellence meant nothing against American industrial might. In the 1970s, I started reading about tank design, engineering books, military history, trying to understand objectively what had happened, why we lost, what the Sherman represented, and I came to appreciate it, truly appreciate it. The Sherman was a triumph of pragmatic engineering, not the best tank in any single category, but good enough in every category, and built in such numbers that individual superiority didn't matter. The Americans understood something we didn't. War is industrial. It's about production capacity, logistics, training capacity, resource management. The Wehrmacht was a craftsman's army trying to fight an industrial war. We built masterpiece tanks one at a time. The Americans built good enough tanks on assembly lines. We lost to their factories as much as to their soldiers. That's what I understood, standing in that Sherman in December 1944. That's what I carried with me for the next 50 years. The knowledge that I'd fought for the wrong side in a war we couldn't win, prolonging suffering for nothing, and the grudging respect for the engineering philosophy that beat us, mass production, standardization, reliability, maintainability. Quantity has a quality all its own. The Sherman taught me that. One tank, one examination, one moment of clarity in December 1944. Everything after that was just confirming what I already knew. The war was over. We just hadn't stopped dying yet. August 1946. I stepped off the train in Stuttgart and barely recognized my city. The station where I'd departed as a young soldier in 1939 was a shell. The cathedral I'd attended as a child had one wall standing. The neighborhood where I'd grown up was rubble. Block after block of ruins, women digging through debris, children playing in bombed-out buildings, old men searching for anything salvageable. This was what we'd fought for. This was what 6 years of war had bought us. Ruins and death and shame. My sister Margaret met me at what remained of the station. She was 32 years old but looked 50, gaunt, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that had been patched a dozen times. When she saw me, she burst into tears. "Hans, you're alive! I thought, they told me you were missing. I thought you were dead." We embraced. I could feel her ribs through her thin coat. "How bad is it?" I asked, though I could see for myself. "We're starving," she said simply. Mother died in the bombing in March 1944. Ludwig died at Stalingrad. You knew that already. They notified us in 43. Father's death certificate from the Great War turned out to be the lucky one. He didn't live to see this. She led me through the ruins to what had been our family home. The building was partially destroyed. One wall collapsed, the roof caved in on one side, but part of it was still habitable. Margaret lived there with her husband Friedrich, who'd lost his left arm on the Eastern Front, and their 2 children, 7 and 5 years old, both thin, both quiet in the way children are when they've learned that making noise attracts bad attention. "We have a little food," Margaret said. "The Americans give rations, not much, but enough to survive. Friedrich got a job clearing rubble. They pay in cigarettes and food. We trade the cigarettes for other things we need." This was Germany in 1946. bombed into rubble, occupied by four powers, American, British, French, Soviet, divided, defeated, humiliated, starving, and every German carried the weight of what we'd done, what we'd allowed, what we'd fought for. I got a job 3 weeks after returning. My uncle's machine shop had survived the bombing, just barely. One building out of an entire city block. Uncle Werner hired me immediately. "We need skilled workers," he said. "The city needs to be rebuilt. Machines need to be repaired. The occupation forces need maintenance work done. There's plenty of work. Not much pay, but work." The pay was in Reichsmarks, which were nearly worthless. What mattered was the cigarette rations and the connections to the black market. Everyone in Germany survived through the black market. Official rations gave you maybe 500 calories a day. You needed the black market to actually survive. I worked 12-hour days, fixed machines, welded metal, machined parts. The work was mindless, which was good. It kept me from thinking too much, kept me from remembering, kept me from asking the questions that had no good answers. At night, I'd lie awake in the partially destroyed house and remember the war, remember my crew, Klaus, who could fix any engine, Otto with his careful radio procedures, Werner, who could hit targets at ranges I thought impossible, young Hans Weber, who asked why we were still fighting and died at 19 before getting an answer. I'd remember the Sherman, standing inside it, understanding what it represented, understanding that we'd lost before we even started. We just didn't know it yet. And I'd remember the other things, the things we didn't talk about, the retreats through Russian villages we'd burned, the partisan suspects we'd shot without trial, the Jews we'd seen being rounded up and sent somewhere. We didn't ask where. The concentration camp we'd driven past in Poland, with the smell that told you everything you needed to know, even if you didn't want to believe it. I was complicit. We all were. I was just a soldier, wasn't a defense. It wasn't even true. I'd made choices. I'd followed orders I knew were wrong. I'd chosen not to see what I didn't want to see. How do you live with that? How do you wake up every morning knowing you fought for the regime that murdered 6 million Jews? That you prolonged that war, gave them more time to kill? I didn't have an answer, none of us did, so we just worked, rebuilt, tried to survive, didn't talk about the war, didn't talk about what we'd done, buried it deep and hoped it would stay buried. In 1948, everything changed. The Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutsche Mark. Overnight, the economy started functioning again. The black market collapsed because real money was worth something again. Food appeared in shops. The economic miracle was beginning. Marshall Plan money poured in. American aid to rebuild Western Europe. Billions of dollars. Machinery. Raw materials. Technical assistance. The Americans rebuilt the countries they'd defeated. I remember thinking, this is the Sherman philosophy again, not revenge, not punishment. Practical investment in stability and prosperity. Build us up so we're prosperous trading partners instead of desperate enemies. Good enough to work, replicated across Western Europe. The Soviets took a different approach in their occupation zone. They stripped factories, took reparations, imposed communism. The contrast was stark. By 1949, Germany was officially divided. Federal Republic of Germany in the west, German Democratic Republic in the east. The Iron Curtain ran right through our country. Berlin, the old capital, was divided too. An island of Western occupation inside Soviet territory. It became a symbol, freedom versus tyranny, capitalism versus communism. The same alliance that had defeated us was now splitting into Cold War enemies, and we Germans found ourselves in the middle, the front line of a new conflict. In 1950, I married Greta Hoffmann. She was a secretary in a construction company, 26 years old, hadn't been political before the war, lost her father in France in 1940, her brother in Russia in 1942. She understood loss, understood guilt, understood the need to move forward because looking back was unbearable. We married in a simple ceremony. No big celebration. Nobody had money for that, and besides, who felt like celebrating? We rented a small apartment in a newly rebuilt building, started a life together, tried to be normal. Our first child, Peter, was born in 1951. Our daughter, Anna, came in 1953. I held them as babies and thought, they're born into a different Germany. They'll never know the Reich. They'll grow up in a democracy. They'll learn about the war in history books, not by living through it. But what would I tell them? How would I explain what their father did between 1939 and 1945? How would I make them understand that good people can fight for evil causes? That soldiers can be both victims and perpetrators? That history is complicated and morality is not simple? I didn't have answers, so I mostly stayed silent. When Peter asked about the war, and children always ask, I gave simple answers. I was a soldier. I fought. It was terrible. We lost. Now we must build a better Germany. Greta understood. She never pushed. She knew I carried something heavy. We both did. All Germans of our generation did. The weight of what we'd done, what we'd allowed, what we'd survived while others didn't. My uncle retired in 1955, and I took over the machine shop, renamed it Steiner Engineering. We did well. The German economy was booming, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Everyone needed precision parts, maintenance, fabrication. We expanded, hired workers. I was a successful small businessman. I was good at it. Good at understanding machines, good at solving engineering problems, good at seeing how things fit together. The war had taught me that, at least. Tank maintenance makes you appreciate precision, reliability, efficiency. Sometimes I'd work on a repair and think about the Sherman, about its design philosophy, simplicity over complexity, reliability over perfection, maintainability over peak performance. I found myself applying those lessons, building machines that worked well rather than perfectly, designing repairs that were good enough and could be done quickly rather than ideal but time-consuming. American engineering philosophy, learned from examining an enemy tank in December 1944, applied to running a machine shop in 1950s Germany. The irony wasn't lost on me. In 1960, Peter asked me about tanks. He was 9 years old, fascinated by military vehicles the way boys are. "Papa, did you really command a tank? What kind? What was it like?" I hesitated. How much should I tell him? How much could a 9-year-old understand? "I commanded a Panzer IV," I said. "It was a medium tank, good machine, reliable. It served us well." "Did you fight American tanks, Shermans?" "Yes, I fought Shermans." "Did you win?" Such a simple question, such a complicated answer. Sometimes we won individual battles, but we lost the war. The Americans had many more tanks than we did, many more of everything. Numbers matter, Peter. Quality is important, but quantity wins wars. Were their tanks better than ours? I thought about this carefully. Not better in every way. Our tanks had better armor and guns in some cases, but their tanks were better in other ways, more reliable, easier to fix. They could build many tanks quickly. We could build fewer tanks slowly. In the end, they won. That's what matters. Peter accepted this. Children do. They don't yet understand the moral complexity, the guilt, the shame. They just hear we fought, we lost, that's history. I envied that simplicity. The 1960s brought prosperity. The machine shop grew. We bought a house, a car, took vacations. Peter and Anna went to good schools. We were middle class, successful, normal, but I was still haunted. The nightmares never fully stopped. I'd dream of burning tanks, of Russian winter, of Bastogne, of the Sherman, sitting in that Belgian town square, teaching me lessons I didn't want to learn. And I'd dream of my crew. Klaus, Otto, Werner, Hans, killed in the last month of the war, died for nothing, for a regime that had already lost, for a cause that was evil from the start. I'd wake up sweating. Greta would hold me and not ask questions. What was there to say? The war was over. We'd moved on, except we hadn't. Not really. It was always there, just below the surface. In 1961, the East Germans built the Berlin Wall. Overnight, concrete and barbed wire dividing the city, dividing families, trapping people on the Soviet side. It stood as a monument to the Cold War, to divided Germany, to the consequences of the war we'd started and lost. I took Peter and Anna to see it once, in 1965. They were teenagers by then, old enough to understand some of the complexity. Why did they build it? Anna asked, looking at the ugly concrete wall topped with barbed wire and guard towers. To keep people from leaving, I said. East Germany was losing citizens, doctors, engineers, teachers. Anyone who could escape to the West did, so they built a wall to trap them. That's terrible, Peter said. Why don't the Americans tear it down? Because that would start a war. A real war. Maybe even a nuclear war. So the wall stays, and families stay divided, and people stay trapped. This is the world we live in now, the world created by the last war. We stood there looking at the wall, this ugly scar across a city, across a country, across history. Papa, Anna said quietly, were you on the right side in the war? The question I'd dreaded for 20 years. How do you tell your daughter that you fought for the wrong side, that you wore the uniform of evil, that you were complicit in genocide? No, I said. We were not on the right side. We were wrong. What our government did was evil. What we fought for was wrong. I was a soldier. I did my duty, but my duty was to the wrong cause. And I will carry that shame until I die. Anna and Peter looked at me with wide eyes. I'd never spoken so directly about it before. But you didn't know, Anna said. You didn't know about the camps. You couldn't have known. I knew enough, I said. Maybe not the full scale, but I knew Jews were being persecuted. I knew people were disappearing. I knew our government was evil. I just chose not to think about it, chose to focus on my duty, my crew, my survival. That doesn't make me innocent. It makes me complicit. We rode home in silence. I don't know what they thought about that conversation. We never discussed it again, but it was said. The truth was spoken. My children knew what their father had been, what he'd done, what he carried. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it wasn't. But it was honest. The 1970s brought reflection. West Germany was wrestling with its past. The generation that fought the war was aging. Their children were asking questions. Television documentaries examined the Nazi period. Trials of war criminals continued. The Holocaust was taught in schools. It was uncomfortable, painful, necessary. I started reading history books, memoirs, technical manuals. I wanted to understand objectively what had happened, why we lost, how the Allies won, what role technology and engineering played. I read about the Sherman tank, about its development, its production, its use in combat. I learned that I wasn't alone in my assessment. Many German tank commanders had respected the Sherman, not for its individual combat capability. A Tiger or Panther could destroy a Sherman in a fair fight, but for what it represented. American industrial might, production capacity, logistics, the ability to field overwhelming numbers of adequate machines rather than small numbers of excellent machines. I read that General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's premier tank commanders, had said after the war that Germany lost because we couldn't match Allied production, that our tanks were superior technically but too few strategically, that we lost the war in the factories of Detroit and the Urals. I read that Soviet Marshal Zhukov said the Sherman was a good tank, not the best tank, but good enough. And there were so many of them. Lend-Lease supplied thousands of Shermans to the Soviet Union. They fought alongside T-34s. They were well liked by Soviet crews for their reliability and ease of maintenance. The Sherman was never going to win Tank of the War awards. It was outgunned by German heavy tanks, out-armored by Soviet heavy tanks. But it didn't matter, because there were 50,000 of them, because they could be repaired in the field by ordinary mechanics, because their crews could be trained in weeks rather than months. Because they embodied a philosophy of war that understood industrial capacity matters more than individual excellence. I'd understood this in December 1944, standing inside that captured Sherman. But I'd understood it emotionally, intuitively. Now, 30 years later, I understood it intellectually. I could articulate why the Sherman represented Allied victory, why Germany had been doomed from the moment America entered the war. We'd tried to fight an industrial war with artisan methods. We'd built masterpieces. They'd built assembly lines. We lost to their factories. In 1979, I retired from the machine shop, sold it to a larger company. The money was good. Greta and I were comfortable. Peter was an engineer, working for Daimler-Benz. Anna was a teacher. We had grandchildren. Life was good, but I was 63 years old, the same age many of my comrades had been when they died. Klaus, Otto, Werner, Hans Weber. They never got to retire, never got to see grandchildren, never got to live in a prosperous, peaceful Germany. I'd gotten all of that. Why? What made me special? Nothing, just luck. I'd survived and they hadn't. Random chance. The same reason I'd examined that Sherman instead of dying in it. Survivor's guilt. I'd carried it for 35 years. Would carry it until I died. I started volunteering at a local school, talking to students about the war, not glorifying it, not hiding from it, just telling the truth, what it was like, what we did. What we should have done differently, what they should learn from our mistakes. Young Germans in the 1970s and 80s wanted to know. They'd been taught in school about the Holocaust, about German war crimes, about the evil of the Nazi regime. But they wanted to hear from someone who'd been there, who'd worn the uniform, who'd fought. Why did you fight? They'd ask. Always that question. Why did you keep fighting when you knew you were losing, when you knew the cause was evil? Because we were soldiers, I'd answer, because we'd been trained to obey, because our families were behind us and the enemy was in front of us, because stopping would mean abandoning our comrades, because we were trapped in a machine we'd helped build and couldn't escape. But you knew it was wrong. Not at first. At first we believed the propaganda. We believed we were defending Germany. But yes, eventually we knew. I knew by 1944 at the latest, and I kept fighting anyway. That's my shame. I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway. What should we learn from that? That following orders isn't an excuse. That just doing my duty isn't enough. That you have to think about what cause you're serving. That technical excellence means nothing if you're using it for evil. That being good at something doesn't make it right. These conversations were painful, but necessary. The students needed to hear it. Germany needed to hear it. We needed to reckon with what we'd done, not hide from it, not minimize it, own it, learn from it, make sure it never happened again. November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. I watched on television as young people climbed on the wall, hammered at it, tore it down. East Germans poured through checkpoints. Families reunited. The division that had lasted 44 years was ending. I cried watching it. Greta held my hand and we cried together, because it meant something. It meant the war was finally, truly over. The consequences were finally ending. Germany would be united again, free, democratic, at peace. The Cold War had been the aftermath of our war. The division of Germany was punishment for what we'd done, and now it was ending. Not because we deserved it, but because history moves forward. Because the world had changed. Because a new generation had made different choices. In October 1990, Germany reunified officially, one country again. For the first time since 1945, the Federal Republic absorbed the Democratic Republic. We became one Germany. Still carrying the weight of history, but moving forward. I was 74 years old. I'd lived long enough to see Germany divided and reunited, to see us go from aggressor to defeated, to prosperous to reunified, to see my children grow up in democracy and freedom, to see my grandchildren who had no memory of the war. It was more than I deserved, more than Klaus or Otto or Werner or Hans got. They died in ruins and I lived to see rebirth. Why? No reason, just chance, just the random outcome of who was in which tank when the rocket hit. Just the luck of survival. December 1994, 50 years after Bastogne, 50 years after I stood inside that captured Sherman and understood what it meant. I was 78 years old. Greta had died the previous year. Cancer. Peter and Anna were middle-aged with families of their own. I lived alone in our house in Stuttgart, surrounded by memories. A letter arrived. From Belgium. From a Battle of the Bulge commemoration committee. They were organizing a 50th anniversary event. Veterans from all sides were invited. American, British, German. Would I attend? I almost declined. What was the point? To stand with other old men and remember when we tried to kill each other, to celebrate survival while better men died. But I went. In December, 50 years to the day after the offensive began. The ceremony was in Bastogne, the town I'd tried to capture in 1944, the town that held against us, the town that symbolized American resistance and German failure. It looked so different, rebuilt, prosperous, peaceful. The square where I'd found that Sherman was now a parking lot. The positions we'd attacked were now homes and shops. The battlefield was a town again. There were maybe 200 veterans there. Most American. They'd won, they had more survivors, they were better at organizing these things. A handful of British, a few Belgians, and about 20 Germans. We didn't segregate ourselves. The organizers mixed us deliberately. Americans sat with Germans, British with Germans, former enemies sharing coffee and memories. I found myself sitting next to an American veteran, Frank Kowalski, 76 years old. He'd been a Sherman tank commander in the 10th Armored Division, fought at Bastogne. Which unit? He asked, when he learned I'd been Panzer commander. 2nd Panzer Division, I said. We attacked from the northeast. We hit you guys pretty hard on December 23rd, Frank said. Once the weather cleared and our planes could fly, must have been hell for you. It was, I said. We had no air cover, no fuel. We were sitting ducks for your P-47s. We talked for an hour, comparing experiences. He told me about defending Bastogne, about the cold, about the German artillery, about being surrounded, about Patton's Third Army breaking through to relieve them. I told him about the offensive, about the initial success, about the supply problems, about running out of fuel, about the retreat. I examined one of your Shermans, I said. On December 22nd, in a town northeast of Bastogne. It had been abandoned. Intact. My crew and I spent 2 hours looking at it. Frank laughed. Yeah, we left a lot of equipment behind in those first few days. You guys surprised the hell out of us. We were running. What did you think of the Sherman? I thought it was remarkable, I said honestly. Not because it was the best tank. It wasn't. Our Panther was better in a straight fight. But your Sherman was brilliant in other ways. Reliable, easy to maintain, well designed for mass production. That's when I understood we were going to lose. When I saw that you could build thousands of adequate tanks while we built hundreds of excellent ones. Frank nodded slowly. You know, we used to joke about the Sherman, called it a Ronson, lights first time every time, because they caught fire easily. German tanks scared the shit out of us. Your armor was thicker, your guns were better, but we had 10 Shermans for every Panther you had. And when we lost one, there was another one right behind it. You couldn't replace yours. Exactly, I said. That's what the Sherman represented to me. Not individual superiority, systemic superiority, industrial superiority. You won the war in your factories before we ever met on the battlefield. I never thought about it that way, Frank said. But you're right. We outproduced you. That was the real weapon. We sat in silence for a moment. Two old men who'd tried to kill each other 50 years ago, now discussing engineering philosophy over coffee in the town we'd fought over. "I'm sorry," I said suddenly, "for what we did, for what Germany did, for the war, for the Holocaust, for all of it. I was a soldier. I followed orders, but that's not an excuse. I fought for evil. I'm sorry." Frank looked at me. His eyes were kind. "You don't need to apologize to me personally. I survived. I did fine. But yeah, your country did terrible things. The Holocaust, the genocide, that's unforgivable. But you, personally, you were a soldier, like me, caught in a war you didn't start. I don't hold it against you." "You should," I said. "We all should have refused, should have said no, should have fought against the regime instead of for it. But we didn't. We just followed orders. That's our crime." "Maybe," Frank said. "Or maybe you were just a kid who got caught up in something bigger than you could control. Maybe we all were. Maybe the real criminals were the leaders who started it, and they're dead. Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, all dead. You survived. That's not a crime. That's just luck." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't fully, because I knew what I'd done, what I'd seen, what I'd chosen not to see. The complicity ran deep, but his words helped. A little. Enough to ease the weight slightly. Enough to let me breathe a little easier. The ceremony that afternoon was held at the Mardasson Memorial, a monument to American soldiers who died in the Ardennes. Speeches from dignitaries, wreath-laying, moments of silence. But what struck me most was the German delegation. 20 of us, old men in civilian clothes, some wearing their medals. We were allowed to wear them with certain exceptions. Iron crosses, Eastern Front medals, wound badges. One German veteran, I didn't catch his name, gave a short speech, in German, translated to English and French. "We come here not to celebrate," he said, "but to remember those who died, American, British, Belgian, German, to remember what war costs, to remember what we did, the cause we fought for, and the evil that regime represented. We cannot change the past. We can only learn from it. We can only commit to ensuring such evil never rises again. We lost this battle. We lost this war. Germany deserved to lose, but we honor the memory of the soldiers on all sides who fought and died. And we commit to peace, to reconciliation, to building a better world than the one we destroyed." It was honest, painful, true. That's all we could do. Acknowledge the truth, own the guilt, commit to better. After the ceremony, Frank found me again. "I want to show you something," he said. He led me to a quiet corner of the memorial, pulled out a worn photograph, black and white, a Sherman tank, crew posing beside it, 5 young men in American uniforms, all smiling. "That's my Sherman," Frank said. "December 1944. 2 of these guys died that month. One lost both legs. One was okay. And me. I made it through. But I think about those 2 who died all the time. Why them and not me? No reason, just chance." "I know," I said. "I lost my entire crew in April 1945, last month of the war. They died and I lived. I've spent 50 years asking why. There's no answer, just random chance." Frank nodded, put the photo away. "You asked me what I thought about German engineering, about the tanks you built. Want to know the truth? Yes. Your tanks were magnificent, over-engineered, too complex, too expensive, but magnificent. If you'd had unlimited resources, unlimited fuel, unlimited time, you'd have won every battle. But you didn't. You had limited resources and you spent them on complexity instead of quantity. That was your mistake. Not an engineering mistake, a strategic mistake." "I know," I said. "I learned that lesson standing inside your Sherman 50 years ago this week, in a Belgian town square, understanding that we'd lost the war in your factories, that all our engineering excellence meant nothing against your production capacity. And I learned a lesson too, Frank said. That individual excellence matters, that your tanks scared us even though we outnumbered you. That technology makes a difference, even when you have numerical advantage. My Sherman wasn't the best tank, but there were enough of us to win. That's the lesson. Good enough in quantity beats excellent in scarcity. We shook hands. Two old tank commanders, former enemies. Now just two old men who understood machines and war and the complicated relationship between them. Thank you, I said, for this conversation, for your understanding, for your forgiveness, even if I don't deserve it. We all deserve forgiveness, Frank said, or none of us do. Either way, we're too old to carry hate. 50 years is long enough. Time to let it go. I flew back to Germany the next day, returned to Stuttgart, to my empty house, to my memories. But something had changed. Some weight had lifted, not all of it. I'd carry guilt until I died, but some of it was lighter, because I'd spoken truth, because I'd been heard, because a former enemy had offered understanding. I spent the next few years writing, a memoir of sorts, not for publication, just for my family, for Peter and Anna, for my grandchildren, so they'd know, so they'd understand what their grandfather did, what he saw, what he carried. I wrote about the war, about Poland and France and Russia and Belgium, about commanding a Panzer IV, about my crew, about the battles won and lost, about the retreat and defeat, and I wrote about the Sherman, about standing inside it on December 22nd, 1944, about understanding what it represented, about learning the lesson it taught, about respecting enemy engineering even as I fought against it, about how a machine can teach you truth, about how engineering philosophy reveals national character, about how good enough in quantity beats excellent in scarcity, about how industrial war is won in factories as much as battlefields. I wrote about complicity, about guilt, about the choices I made and didn't make, about following orders, about the Holocaust I didn't prevent, about the evil I served even if I didn't believe in it. I wrote about survival, about luck, about why I lived when better men died, about carrying their memory, about the responsibility of witnessing, about telling the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And I wrote about forgiveness, about Frank Kowalski, about that conversation in Bastogne, about understanding that enemies can become friends. That hate doesn't have to be eternal. That 50 years is long enough to carry the weight. I finished writing in 1998, put the memoir in a folder, gave it to Peter and Anna. Read it when I'm gone, I said. Share it with your children when they're old enough. Make sure they know, make sure they understand, make sure they never forget. I died in 2002, 86 years old, heart failure, peaceful, I'm told, in my sleep, more mercy than I deserved. But this story doesn't end with my death. It ends with what came after. Peter read the memoir, shared it with his children, my grandchildren. One of them, also named Hans, studied engineering. He became fascinated with the Sherman tank story, with the engineering philosophy I'd described, with the lessons about design and production and industrial war. In 2012, Hans wrote his thesis at Technical University of Munich on production philosophy in World War II tank design, a comparative analysis of German and American approaches. It examined exactly what I'd understood in that Belgian town square in 1944, how the Germans prioritized technical excellence over producibility, how the Americans prioritized producibility over technical excellence, how both approaches had merits, how the American approach won because war is industrial. He interviewed me extensively for the thesis. This was 2000, 2 years before I died, asked detailed questions about the Sherman I'd examined, about Panzer IV design, about maintenance in the field, about logistics, about everything. Grossvater, he said, you understood something in 1944 that most people still don't understand, that engineering isn't just about making the best thing, it's about making the right thing for the context. The Sherman was the right tank for America in 1944. Mass-producible, reliable, good enough. That's brilliant engineering, even if it wasn't the most advanced. Yes, I said. That's exactly right. The Americans understood the problem they were solving. They weren't building a tank to win individual battles. They were building a tank to win a war of production. Different problem, different solution. Hans published his thesis. It won awards. He went on to work for an automotive company, applying those same principles, building cars that are good enough, reliable, mass-producible, not the most advanced, not the highest performance, but the right product for the market. Sherman philosophy. Learned from examining an enemy tank 60 years later. My grandson understood what I'd understood in December 1944. That engineering is about solving the right problem. That context matters more than technical excellence. That industrial war requires industrial thinking. And he carried that lesson forward, made it his career, applied it to peacetime products, turned a weapon into a philosophy that builds instead of destroys. That's redemption, maybe. Taking a lesson learned in war and applying it to peace. Taking understanding gained from examining enemy weapons and using it to build consumer goods. Taking the weight of history and transforming it into progress. I didn't live to see all of this. I died in 2002, but Peter told me before I died that Hans was working on the thesis, that my memoir had inspired him, that the Sherman story mattered to a new generation. That was enough. That was more than I deserved. To know that the lesson I learned in December 1944 would be carried forward, that something good could come from all that horror, that understanding could bridge even the divide between enemies. Author's note, added by Peter Steiner, 2015. My father died in 2002. He carried guilt his entire life for fighting in World War II, for serving the Nazi regime, even as a soldier who never joined the party, who didn't believe in their ideology, who was just trying to survive. He never fully forgave himself, but he spent 50 years trying to atone, teaching young Germans about the war, being honest about complicity, writing his memoir so we'd understand. The Sherman tank story was central to his understanding. He told it many times, to his children, to his grandchildren, to students, to anyone who would listen, about examining that captured tank in December 1944, about understanding through that one machine what Germany was really fighting against, about respecting enemy engineering even as he fought them, about learning lessons that applied beyond war. My son Hans built his career on that lesson. Others who read the memoir have been affected by it. The story has rippled outward in ways my father never knew. This is his legacy, not the war he fought, not the uniform he wore, not the guilt he carried, but the lesson he learned and passed forward, that engineering teaches truth, that enemies can be respected, that understanding matters, that redemption is possible through honesty and teaching and ensuring the next generation learns from our mistakes. The Sherman taught him that lesson, and he taught it to us, and we carry it forward. That's what survives, not the war, not the guilt, the lesson. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If Hans Steiner's testimony moved you, if it taught you something about engineering, about war, about the complexity of history and the possibility of redemption, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button. And most importantly, comment below, sharing your thoughts. Have you ever learned a lesson from studying something your enemy or competitor made? Have you ever understood a bigger truth through examining a single object? Share your insights. These technical and human stories matter, and your engagement helps ensure more people hear them. Remember, we learn from history not to glorify war, but to understand humanity in all its complexity. Engineering tells stories, machines teach lessons, and sometimes examining your enemy's work teaches you more than any victory ever could. See you in the next video, and thank you for being part of keeping these layered, honest stories alive.